And it's a great pleasure to have John Taylor here today from Rugby School. It's good to have a real teacher amongst us rather than those of us who dabble around with the products of your schools instead, which I'm very glad to do as well at universities. John's had an interesting career because he's head of physics, but he's also a philosopher. He's also in charge of philosophy at Rugby School and taught philosophy at Oxford University. Before he did that, he tutored that. He's also involved in a project, as you'll see from his CV, on Perspectives on Science, POS project for the last 10 years. So John is going to speak to us today on Perspectives on Science, and we're greatly looking forward to it from the coalface, so to speak. So thank you very much, John.
Well, thank you very much. Well, thank you. As Bob says, I'm sort of wearing a couple of hats, I suppose, today. One is my teaching hat as someone who practices at the coalface or chalk face. No longer chalk, of course. Now we have electronic whiteboards. And so really, most of what I'm going to say today has probably quite a strongly classroom-oriented focus. And I hope you know, for those who aren't teachers here, that won't be too much of a distraction, because really the main message from today, for this morning and the sessions we'll look at this afternoon, is that well, it's a chance to explore a course or qualification which I think does a lot, which is very exciting and can be transferred into other contexts as well, as a way of essentially getting students doing more thinking. And of course, when we're doing that in the classroom, that's tremendously exciting, tremendously fun for the students, but it's also fun for us as the teachers, the facilitators of the learning experience. And so I hope, as I say, for those of us who aren't perhaps involved directly in classroom interaction with students, the thought-provoking element in the activities we'll look at and the structure of the course will be something that you can profit from learning more of as well. So one hat, as I say, is a teaching hat. I also wear an assessment qualifications development hat, in that I'm the chief examiner with EdXL for a qualification called the Extended Project. Has anybody heard of the Extended Project? Okay, you see, I know I'm in Cambridge because that's about 4 or 5 people in the room who've heard of it. Highly informed audience. Usually, even when I'm speaking to some people who really should know more about the current state of education, usually I find virtually zero background knowledge. So even 4 or 5 of us who've heard of it is a good start. But essentially, the Extended Project is quite a significant part of the education reform, the changes to A-level, and the introduction of the diploma programme, which has happened, started in this last September. And so it's something which, if you haven't heard of it yet, you will certainly be hearing more of in the coming months. And as I say, I'm chief examiner with EdXL for their project qualifications, and I'll be explaining a little bit about how the Perspectives course, which is where my own involvement began, has sort of flowed into that, and so there's a sort of an extra element for us to look at as well there. So, what I'm going to do this morning in the first, we've got an hour for me to talk to you and half an hour for you to talk back, but I'm quite happy if you want to interject in the course of what I'm saying. Please do. Please don't just sit there with burning questions. Let's interact right from the start. What I'm hoping to do in the first session anyway is to give you a brief overview of this qualification and its development and the aims of it and of how it works in the classroom, and in essence give you not quite enough to perhaps take it away and start teaching, but get you close to that point where you feel confident that yes, I could use this course in my school if you're in a school. If you wanted to know more about that, there is a training programme which covers in a lot more depth and detail the kind of issues we'll probably touch on today, which I'm involved in, and do email me if you want details of that. But as I say, I'm hoping in the first session we can give you an overview, and then this afternoon, in the Sunday afternoon after lunch slot, we'll do some of the activities from the course, which are great fun, and will generate, I hope, a lot of discussion and debate, and start to give you a flavour of how this works and why it's generated such a lot of excitement amongst pupils and teachers and academics in HE who value the emphasis on thinking, getting students actually to think. So that's what it's all about. I got asked over coffee actually what my title means as Director of Critical Skills. I may be the only such in the world as far as I know. Really, in essence, that is the same point. That my job is, as I put it, to make students think, or to help students think. And you'll see it as the morning and afternoon unfolds, a few of the sort of tricks up my sleeve I use for doing that. So that's where I aim to go. A little bit of history then on the qualification. The Perspectives course began officially in 2004 as a freestanding AS level qualification in the history, philosophy and ethics of science. Going a little bit further back, I'll give you some of the prehistory of the course and its development. It really began 10 years ago with a team of us working on putting the qualification together. It ran for 5 years up until last year as a freestanding AS, and then since September, when, as I mentioned, the new extended projects came on stream, the qualification has sort of been merged in to this wider qualification structure called the extended project. So that's where we came from, and the people that have been involved in its development are principally myself, Rugby School, and a colleague, Elizabeth Swinbank, from the Science Curriculum Centre at the University of York. We've had support from Cast of Thousands, we've had sponsorship from the Royal Society, the Wellcome Trust and the erstwhile P Park, and we've essentially involved in developing the course. We've involved a very broad cross-section of teachers, authors, academics. So it's something which has got, if you like, a strong pedigree and support from various influential and learned people. As I mentioned, the development of the project began really 10 years ago, and it started from a conversation that I had in the summer at a science teaching conference. And it was, for those of us who are in education at the time, you remember 1999, we were just about to experience the next phase of change, which was the introduction of Curriculum 2000, with the breaking up of A-levels into AS and A2. And I still remember the conversation. I said to two colleagues, Liz Swinbank and another colleague who was then on the Education Committee of the Royal Society, wouldn't it be nice if we had an AS level in the history and philosophy of science? Little knowing where that would lead in the subsequent 10 years. And anyway, one thing led to another. We got together a group of interested teachers, writers and so on, and with the support from the Royal Society, we started work on a sort of pilot for the project, essentially. And what we did was produce some booklets which we circulated to teachers who tried out some of the activities from the course, and that led in 2002 to a bid to the Wellcome Trust for funding for the course development, and that substantially was what led to the creation of the course resources, which is published now 2 years ago. I've got a copy here if you want to browse over lunch. So there's a very substantial pack of teaching and student guide resources to support the course. And we also obviously, because it's important with this kind of work, I think, to actually get it officially on the curriculum rather than, as it were, being around the edges. We talked to edXL from an early stage, and they were happy to take the qualification on, and we began teaching in 2004. The size of the pilot qualification wasn't huge, but nevertheless it was a good pilot, I think, with a good representative cross-section of centres involved. So in the end, the final year that we ran as an AS, there were around about just over 30 centres doing Perspectives. My estimate is now there's probably something like 40 to 50 centres around the country who are following this model or using it in their teaching in some form or another. So that's the Perspectives part of the story, how Perspectives came into being. Around about 2006, I started to find that when I was doing meetings a little bit like this, or training teachers in assessment and so on, whole troops of officials from QCA, the exam board regulator, would come in. Now, this wasn't, I think, because I was doing it particularly badly. It was because they were interested in the approach. And it became clear to me why this was. Going back to 2004, there was a white paper which laid out the structure of the change that we've seen introduced since last September to A-levels and the diploma programme and so on. And one of the things that was recommended right back in 2004 was that it would be good for students to have the opportunity to engage in an extended research project on a topic of their own choosing. And so talk about extended projects was in the air, and because the Perspectives course is essentially that, it's not an examined course. The students write a dissertation and make a presentation as the only forms of assessment. Because we were doing that already, this became something which QCA were very interested in, and keen to learn from. And so, as I say, I had various highly placed officials coming into my training meetings taking copious notes. That was very encouraging, because of course it meant that the Perspectives model, which I think is a very credible and robust approach to doing this kind of work with sixth form students, has been able to influence what is now a very wide and large-scale development in our national educational provision. And the extended project, which was officially launched this last September, is, I think, probably one of the fastest growing qualifications in the country. And although it's still relatively small, maybe several thousand students doing it this year, it will grow very quickly indeed. And I think it's quite conceivable that within the next 5 or 10 years, most sixth form students will be doing this or something like it. And so part of the approach which the Perspectives model seeks to embody has led into that and informs it. We've also, as well as that sort of evaluation and review of the course, we also commissioned our own evaluation, and from 2007 to 2008, a team of academics from the London Institute of Education visited schools around the country and produced a report this time last year, which I have here, a short research study on the Perspectives on Science AS level course. And this is, I think, a very helpful document if you're interested in this approach to education, either specifically as it relates to the Perspectives course, or more generally, the question that they asked themselves was, what constitutes high quality discussion in the classroom? They got some very interesting survey evidence and some interesting interviews and conversations with both teachers and students, talking about what makes discussion really work in the classroom. And there's some excellent findings which I'll refer to during the course of today's sessions. I've got a hard copy here, but again, you're welcome if you email me, you're welcome if you're interested to take that as a PDF. It's available to be used. I've mentioned effectively, therefore, that there are these two qualifications. There's the Perspectives on Science AS, which ran until last year, and now we have the extended project. So I'll say just a little bit about how they're related before then going on to describe the Perspectives course in more detail. The Perspectives course is, as is the extended project, both qualifications are internally assessed. There's no examination component, and the teachers will be responsible for teaching and then assessing the work, and then sending off samples, as you would for any coursework, to the exam board for external moderation. Both Perspectives and the extended projects are based around research. Research skills are the core, the heart of both qualifications. The Perspectives course, we essentially expected students to write a dissertation. We didn't expect other forms of outcome. But with the extended project, students could write a dissertation, but they could also do one of 3 other types of projects. They could, for example, produce a field study or investigation, which would be similar in outcome as a written report to a dissertation, but would be likely to involve substantial field work, data collection, primary research, and so on. But they could also perform or do something else, produce an artifact. Okay, so what's the definition of an artifact? The definition of an artifact is anything that's not the other 3. Okay, so if you do a creative piece of work involving some sort of manipulation of use of materials, you'll see how general and vague the definition is, we would call that an artifact. But that's in there, basically, bluntly, for the learners who don't want to write lots, but still want to be involved in doing something creative and challenging. In terms of qualification status, Perspectives ran as an AS level, and the extended project is, to all intents and purposes, equivalent to an AS level. Half of an A level would be a better description, actually. In terms of UCAS points, the two are exactly the same UCAS points as a half A level. Interestingly, the extended project will gain an A-star award if you're interested in these things right from this year, which makes it a little bit different from the current AS levels, which, as you may know, aren't awarded an A-star yet. Both of them,
sorry,
question on that.
Again, clarify. You said the extended project accounts for half an A level.
That's right.
Over 2 years, do you know?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
You can. Well, we'll come back to the question of how you timetable.
Yeah.
I run it over 2 years on slightly reduced time over the spread of both years in the 6th one. Lots of centres do it in 1 year. You could do it the same way, either way, depending on what your centre requirements were, essentially. So half an A level. Slightly less, the guided learning hours requirement from the funding point of view is slightly less, because as you'll appreciate, there isn't quite so much teaching involved in an extended project, although one of the things I'm very keen to stress, and do stress when I'm training, is that to teach students research skills is enormously important, and it's absolutely essential in this approach. We cannot assume that even our able students know the way around research. Okay? So this is not at all something for the summer holidays, not in my opinion. And the centres who we saw last year in the pilot cohort for the extended project, the centres that did best were the ones where they'd done structured teaching, research methods, critical handling of sources, thinking skills training, that sort of thing, before they got into the project. And you'll see from the resources that we developed, that's something which I'm very keen should continue with the extended project. There's a presentation component as well. We'll talk a little bit more about that later this morning. The presentation is in there really for two reasons. One, because it's an enormously useful thing for students to do. They're going to be expected to present in some form or other in their vocational life. It's a very valuable transferable skill. And secondly, of course, it's in there as a quality control check. If you're at all worried about the authenticity of the work, then getting the students to stand up and talk for 10 minutes and then take questions on it is a good way of finding out whether or not they actually did it themselves. So that as you see, the perspectives has been essentially a prototype extended project. That's one way of looking at it. It's a little bit more restricted in the sense that we keep a focus on science, and we really ask students to write dissertations. The extended project does the same sort of thing, has a much wider range of subject areas that can be covered and can lead to different types of outcome. Delivery is, says there, 1 or 2 years. That's really up to you if you're teaching it, which centre, in your centre, what model works best. Okay, so that's the background and its relationship to the extended project. I'll talk a little bit now about the aims of the Perspectives programme specifically. And one of those aims was to, as it were, do something about, going back to C.P. Snow and the two cultures, was to do something about this art-science divide, which I think you'd agree we still experience in this country. Students, even with the wider choice that AS level affords them, still categorise themselves as scientists or artists. Maybe if they're an arts side student, they might pick up some biology, but the whole thought that they might be engaged in thinking out the relationship between the arts and the sciences, and they might be challenged to realise that sometimes the subject divisions that we make are slightly arbitrary. That approach really was partly what lay behind our thinking on the Perspectives course. I mean, you'll see from this leaflet, which we produced as a pilot, in the pilot phase right back at the start when we were essentially marketing the concept, we used as a subtext, Discovering Science's Human Face. And really that is one central part of the course, is to help students realise that science is a human activity. Scientists are people too. It's unfortunate, it wasn't deliberate that all of these are dead white male scientists. It just so happened that at the early phase of the course, when we were supported by the Royal Society, we went down to their archive one day, having very limited resources. Those are the images that we were able to, as it were, lay our hands on. But Discovering Science's Human Face is, as I say, a central element in the course, and getting students to realise that scientific theories don't simply drop down, as it were, from God in heaven straight into our scientific textbooks, but they are in fact products of people who work in a certain context, in a certain culture, and who have ideas which are informed from a wide variety of areas. So getting that social and to some extent political element, of course, if you know the philosophy of science literature, you'll know this has been an interesting and controversial aspect, and we don't go a long way down that road with the sociology of science. But nevertheless, we want to say science is continuous with other forms of human academic activity. So that was one central aim. And of course, as soon as you talk about bridging the arts and science divide, you then open up, as it were, the possibility for use of the types of teaching and learning strategies which are more common in the humanities lesson within a science context. Hence, for example, plenty of discussion and debate, exchange of arguments and ideas, really as a central part of the course. That's something we wanted to get and capture within a broadly scientific arena. And so it is essentially, if you like, a way of teaching aspects of science using a more humanities approach. So this is one example. Darwin's Dilemma. You don't need to read the whole thing, but you probably know the story. Alfred Russel Wallace wrote from Asia in February 1858 with a letter which when Darwin received it, posed a dilemma for him. And as I'm sure you know the story, by this stage Darwin had been sitting on his development of the theory of evolution for over 20 years, and what was he to do when he receives a letter from another young researcher out in the field who says that essentially he's come up with the same theory independently, and he's now entrusting his findings and his research to Charles Darwin to propagate to the wider world. And well, we do this as a little ethical teaser for the students and offer them three options. What could Darwin do when he received the letter? Number one, he could destroy the letter, ignore it completely and announce the theory himself. Two, he could put the letter to one side while he announced his theory, and then in a few months later, having claimed priority, he could announce the letter as if it had just arrived. All three he could do as Wallace requested and put forward the letter for publication and thereby lose priority. What should Darwin do? And then we add as a footnote, bear in mind the postal service from the jungles of Southeast Asia was slow and unreliable. And that works very nicely as an exercise because it humanises science nicely. It shows the students that this theory was, there were personal factors at work in the way in which this theory came to us. And so that human element of science, that dramatic element as well as the ethically challenging, ethically engaging element, I think that's the sort of thing we want to try and capture. Incidentally, as a little aside, one of the privileges I had as a result of having worked on this course was to spend some time working with the Natural History Museum, who nearly 3 years ago now acquired the entire archive of Alfred Russel Wallace's writings. And he's an extraordinarily interesting man, actually. As well as being a great naturalist, he was a spiritualist. He wrote letters back from Malaysia which really nicely capture this sort of ambivalent personality. And for example, there was one very sentimental letter in which I think he wrote to a niece or something like that, in which he was talking about a baby orangutan who he was essentially adopting because he found this orangutan in the woods or something. And he goes on, you get this very sort of feeling of a Victorian, sentimental, sort of paternalistic letter home to a young girl. He then goes on later in the letter to explain that the reason the orangutan was orphaned was because he'd shot the mother. That's where you get the hard-nosed Victorian naturalist element. So again, the human face of science. But what if you go on their website, the Natural History Museum has an excellent section devoted, actually, designed for students on the Perspectives course, taking them through various letters by Russel Wallace with comprehension exercises and so forth. It's a really excellent resource, and again takes the Perspectives approach a little bit further in that area. So, yeah, Bob.
Are you going to enlighten us with what Darwin actually did?
Oh yes, perhaps you don't know. I'm sorry, that was actually the point of my anecdote. I get carried away in my anecdote. The point of my anecdote. What actually happened, of course, was, as you probably know, Darwin was a very sick man. The voyages on the Beagle had really and the continuous controversy and stress which he experienced later in life really did for his health, and he was really pretty much housebound at this stage in his life. And so he entrusted the letter to two of his, I think it was Hooker and Huxley, possibly, two of his protégés, who went up to London and essentially at a meeting of the Linnaean Society, which had been convened for another purpose, they stood up just before the official meeting was about to happen and read out both Wallace's letter and also a very hastily cobbled together précis of the theory of evolution which Darwin had written. And interestingly, this event, which of course now with the benefit of hindsight is enormously significant historically, at the time I think it barely caused a ripple. Another interesting point of my anecdote, thanks for reminding me, Bob, another interesting little coda to that particular story. Also in the Natural History Museum archive, they have, you may have seen this as part of the exhibits for Darwin 200, they have several pages from Darwin's original manuscript of The Origin of Species, one of which I got to see. It must be said he had terrible handwriting. And they also have a copy of the Linnaean Society Proceedings. They have Alfred Russel Wallace's own annotated copy of the Linnaean Society Proceedings from the meeting when both theories were announced. And so you see it's quite an important historical document. What does he really think of what Darwin had done? And penciled in on the back page, there's some comments. And he basically says that Darwin, pretty decent chap. So it seems as though there wasn't too much acrimony from his side about what actually happened. So philosophical questions, the second sort of key theme in the course. The way I suppose I'd capture this is by saying this, the Perspectives course, what we deliberately set out to do was to put together a qualification where all of those questions which sometimes come up in science lessons, particularly in the sixth form, so you're talking about some cosmology in a physics lesson, and then a student puts up their hand and says, well, what came before the Big Bang? Or you're talking about genetics in the biology lesson, and someone puts up their hand and says, well, what about cloning? So all of these questions, which are in essence the ones which very often really capture the students' imaginations, partly because I suppose they take us into the territory of philosophy and ethics, where there's controversy and debate, and we're into a realm of opinion. These really gripping philosophical questions, those are the questions which we really wanted to put at the heart of the qualification. So instead of having to teach your science lesson and say after 5 or 10 minutes of exciting discussion, sorry, now we've got to get back to the syllabus, we say, well, this really is what the course is all about. I think as well as that sort of educational, pedagogical motivation for structuring the course this way, there's also, it's also significant, jumping ahead a little bit, it's also significant as well because you can argue, I think, that philosophy is really very well placed. You could argue whether it's uniquely placed. You could certainly argue whether it's very well placed for the development of students' thinking skills. Thinking skills is in some way a slightly ugly phrase, and I use it really partly as a way of marketing the course, because if I stand up and talk to many teachers and say, your 16-year-olds could do philosophy, they're going to think, well, can they really do that? But on the other hand, if I say, well, look, this is a way of developing their thinking skills, then that, this is part of the jargon of education at the moment. It's a phrase which they would be aware of because it's recommended from the QCA and the DCFS that students should be taught thinking skills. And so this is, in a sense, a way of philosophy, I think, is a way of actually putting some flesh on the bones of what otherwise could be a slightly arid thing. But as a way of developing students' ability to think, I find this approach is just tremendously valuable. And what's really interesting is we're just at the point where this becomes more widespread, it's going to be really interesting to see how what they're learning in this context starts to generalise into other areas. Does the fact that students develop their ability to reason and argue and discuss in this area support their learning and thinking in other subjects? I think it does, and I think we'll begin to see more and more evidence of that as it becomes more widespread. Here are some of the questions that my students studied 3 years ago now. This was a cohort that completed in 2006. And I'll just give you a moment to look at some of those. I mean, I'm not suggesting that these are all model questions, but they are, I think, interesting for a couple of reasons. One thing about them is that they are questions which it's fair to say are at different intellectual levels. I mean, these are all good questions and they all led to good, successful projects. But nevertheless, you can see amongst them that some of those questions are really going to be considerably more challenging and really require a lot of in-depth research if they're going to be managed properly. And in this approach, you do see this. You see that students do, in a sense, differentiate themselves. They rise to a level where their abilities can take them. Because there is no cap, there is no sort of cut-off point on the level of writing or research that they can get into. So you do find, and this is not always from the students you expect, you do find some really very good quality writing and thinking indeed. Because it's not the sort of course where they have to stop at a certain point because that's what they need to do for the exam. I mean, that's not the point of the course at all. So there's some genuine differentiation here. But also, I think the most important thing, and this is something I've stressed in my work developing the extended project, really the most important thing about each of these questions as a basis for a successful research project is that they all had a strong personal rationale for their work. There was something here which genuinely engaged the students. This was not something where I'd said to them, right, you're doing Kyoto, you're doing abortion. These were questions that they came up with. And okay, we have a negotiation, we have a dialogue to discuss the exact framing of the question and to make sure it's suitable for the nature of the qualification. But each of these comes from their students' interests. And I think that's tremendously important with the extended project because, bluntly speaking, if you have a 16 or 17-year-old doing a research project for the first time, and you're giving them maybe 6, 8, 10 months to work on it, then you really do want them to be motivated. You really need them to have that motivation, and it will come intrinsically if it's a subject that they're most interested in. Ralph Levinson and the team that did the study of perspectives last year asked, as one part of their questionnaire survey, they asked the students, when you're choosing your research question, what is it that you're looking at? What most what factor most determines your choice of question? Is it, for example, what you're going to aim to do vocationally or at HE, or is it your interest? And overwhelmingly, nearly 3/4 of them said it's personal interest. Now, okay, that will tie in, hopefully, to their own aspirations for HE. But each of these students had a personal motivation. I'll tell you a story about one of these, the chap who studied the question of, is there life after death? And this, again, there's a coda to the story, because he was in email contact with me just a few weeks ago. And now the way we run the course, we give them essentially a whole of the lower 6th year doing some philosophy, some ethics, some research skills, lots of seminars, lots of discussion. We don't really think particularly about the choice of project until virtually the 2nd year of the programme. And then most of the writing happens at the end of the lower 6th year and during the upper 6th year. And so at the end of the lower 6th year, sort of after the AS levels, this particular student was beginning to write his first research proposal, which is the first step we get them to do before they actually write the project. And I remember the conversation with him, because he was saying, well, I'm just not sure what to do my project on. And I said, well, what sort of things are you thinking about? And from the conversation that we had, it became clear that he had a very real, strong existential concern with death. It was something which he was thinking about personally, for whatever reasons. And so I said, well, that could become the basis for a research project. And so he did a little bit more study, and at that stage he was thinking of a career in medicine. And so we did, as part of the project, we looked at essentially history of medicine, changing our definitions of death. We looked at William Harvey, the pumping heart. We looked at brain death criteria from the 1960s and 70s, the influence of transplants and so on. He included, obviously it's a question which overlaps religion, ethics, science and philosophy, so he included a section on the ideas of the soul, going back to Greek ideas of the soul leaving the body and tracing it forward to a more modern and materialist paradigm. He included as well, because he was quite strong and somewhat dogmatic in his views, and really very strongly materialist. So I suggested that he, as part of the process of getting a balanced argument, it would be good to interview someone who could give him an opposing point of view. So he went to talk to the school chaplain, and there's a nice little summary of his interview with the school chaplain as part of his research. And it was a really nicely done project. And as I say, the point is, it came out of a strong personal interest. Now, what I didn't know then was what that would lead to in terms of his own future educational development. But what was interesting is that he emailed me, as I say, literally 5 or 6 weeks ago, to say that he'd subsequently gone on to study neuroscience at King's London, and he's just I guess he's probably now in his 2nd year, and is just about to write a piece for a unit on neuroscience and philosophy, on the mind-body problem, and so on. And he was writing partly to say, he really enjoyed doing this work, and also to ask whether or not I still had a copy of his dissertation. So that's actually added a little bit to my training now for students. The final slide is always keep a copy of your dissertation. You never know when it might come in useful. But I've seen that with him, and I've seen it with other students as well. That not only does this approach actually give a lot to the students in terms of their skills and their confidence as well in terms of tackling the kind of teaching and learning which they'll encounter in higher education, it also serves as a way of focusing their aspirations. Okay, so if they get into a project and really get excited by a research question, then who knows what effect that might have on the courses they either choose, the course they choose to do at university, or the units they choose once they've chosen their course within that. So, personal interest is really crucial. I've talked a bit about thinking skills as a central element in the course. Again, just a little bit of, I suppose it is in a sense a marketing point, but I'm sure you'll know if you're involved in any part of the admissions process for sixth formers that thinking skills tests, the TSA, the BNATs, the LNATs, or LNATs on the way out actually, UKCAT, ELAP and so on, but lots and lots of these aptitude tests proliferating at the moment. And it's very useful to you. I'm not pretending for one moment that doing this course is the thing that they need to do. But on the other hand, it is a very useful way to give them an acquaintance with some of the elements of thinking skills, little bits of critical thinking, some of the points about argument structure and so on, which they'll encounter when they do one of those tests, particularly if they're applying for medicine, BMAT, they'll have to do some critical thinking exercises, and they'll probably get asked a short bioethics stroke philosophy of science themed essay question. So you can see that this approach gives them a lot to talk about there. This is an activity which we'll play in a little while, maybe this morning, maybe this afternoon, so that's something to look forward to. That's one of the thinking skills games, and this is a student developing his research skills. I've talked about the philosophical element, I've talked about the ethics, haven't particularly talked about how we do the history of science. But the history of science teaching of the history of science, if you go back to conventional approaches, the approach that used to be used is what I call from Plato to NATO, which is where you take the whole history of Western thought from the Greeks to the modern age and tell them a bit about everything. So that's you understand what the value of that. You're giving them a good synoptic view, but really we were quite determined to avoid that, because when we structured the course, the whole point of the course is, in the end, that the students will be doing some research on a question they've chosen. So the history that they should study should be history relevant to their question. So really the most useful thing to give them is some methodological skills and some research skills, which they can then apply to whatever question they've selected themselves. And so the way we teach the history of science section is essentially as a short, intensive research methods section, followed by some case study work. Darwin, as I mentioned, is one of our case studies. We also look at cold fusion, Fleisch in the ponds, as it was once described. Cold fusion is a great story to look at because it's relatively contemporary, and of course there's still reverberations, and there's occasional research paper surfaces to say there might still be something in it. So it's got this kind of nice open feel, that it's not closed, it's not hot, it's not completely determined what the outcome was. So we look at cold fusion, we look at Darwin, we look at the development of theory of oxygen, combustion, phlogiston, that sort of thing, and the discovery of the structure of DNA. So just 4 case studies. If you're teaching the course, you have to teach all of them. The point is, these are nice contexts within which students can practice their skills in handling documents, reading documents for a start. We actually give them some historical documents to read, or at least excerpts from them. Reading critically, actually evaluating what they read for objectivity and bias and so on, as they would if they were doing a history A level, and then developing those skills ready for their use in their own project. So really what we call the history of science is really a primer in research methods, with some historical case studies as essentially training grounds before they actually get into their project themselves. This again is an activity which we'll have a go at this afternoon, so flag that up and we'll come back to it. So if history and philosophy are sort of 2 of the cornerstones behind the course, and the other key element is ethics. Now, I think of this as valuable really for 2 major reasons. Firstly, of course, the intrinsic importance to students of doing some ethics. Ethics is, as you know, I'm sure, the academic study of how we should live, and what could be more important than that. So getting students to engage with ethical questions, I think, has an extremely important intrinsic motivation and value. But also, I think pedagogically, it's a very useful way, again, of developing some of the other skills I've been talking about. I mean, we tend to find when they're starting arguments and discussion, it's ethical questions which they find the most tractable, the most readily engaging. And I think that the reason for that is probably twofold. Partly, some of the ethical disputes are they are perhaps slightly more manageable in terms of the level of complexity of analysis that you need to be able to contribute to them. I mean, things like the metaphysics of the mind-body problem is really quite tough indeed, although we do take students into some of that. But ethical debates are slightly more tractable, and it's the sort of thing they'll probably have done if they've done GCSE RE, to have discussions about abortion and euthanasia and so on. So they're slightly more tractable, slightly more familiar, but also they tend to be topics on which the students have quite strong opinions themselves. And I think one of the clearest findings, again, to come back to the research study that Ralph Levinson and Michael Hand and the team from the London Institute of Education the strongest finding of their research for what makes really good quality discussion was that you really need, in a group, you really need some people with some strong opinions, and preferably, quite outre, people who will say something that makes the rest of the group go, how can you even say that? And that's how a discussion gets started. So ethical issues are very, very good indeed, as I say, from a pedagogical point of view. If you want to really foster some discussion and debate in the classroom, then the ethics arena tends to be the place to start. And interestingly, Ralph and Michael broke down, they did a analysis of the research questions that students then chose, and the majority, again about 3/4 I think it was, tended to have an ethical element to them. And this is an approach which, having started this in the perspectives context, from the resources that we're writing for the extended project, I'm basically developing ethics as one of the cornerstones for that too. Okay, so ethics are really very key. Again, there's an activity here, which we'll come back to this afternoon. I've really described in outline the course structure already. I'll say a little bit more about that and a little bit about how it would look on the timetable if you were to be offering this course to your students. A few issues about how the delivery model works, and then I'll just say a little bit about the sort of project structure itself and the assessment end, and then we'll stop and have some discussion. So as I said, we have this sort of twofold split in the course. The first phase is devoted to two things, really. First of all, it's about making sure that the students have skills and confidence, the skills and the confidence they're going to need if they're going to tackle what will be for them probably the largest single piece of work they've ever done in their life in academic terms. So do they know how to structure an argument? Are they aware of core ethical ideas? Have they got some research skills? And so in the first phase of the course, which could last, you could take most of a year over this, depending on how much teaching time you had, we have a lot of seminars, lots of exercises, discussion, debate, things like the Darwin's dilemma, arguments about from the science religion form. We use a lot of those because they're really, again, excellent context for getting students engaged and arguing. So plenty of chance for that in the first half of the course. Getting them to the right point where you're confident they've got the skills needed to tackle research, but also with all of the material that we use in this first part of the course, we chose really quite carefully for two reasons. Partly to make sure that it has this skills focus, but also we picked areas that we knew were likely to be fertile ground for project ideas to come from. So hence we go through lots of the bioethics debates. We look at issues from the debates about science and religion. We look at the mind-body problem, and so on. All of these are, from experience, these tend to be the areas where students want to then engage in terms of their own choice of research question. So by starting them off by looking at case studies from these areas, you're making sure they've got the skills. You're also giving them a good starting point and plenty of stimulus, so that when you have that conversation with a student, you say, "I just don't know what to do for my project." You can say, "Well, what sort of things have you enjoyed studying during the past year?" And then the second phase of the course is whether actually doing some research, actually taking them through the project process. And here, I'm quite keen on advocating that most of this work is done with reasonably close supervision from the teacher, who is essentially now a research supervisor. I don't myself favour the approach of saying to students, "Okay, we've taught you a bit, off you go, see you in 6 months' time with the first draft of your thesis." Okay, now I don't supervise PhD students, but I imagine that wouldn't count as good practice even at that level, or perhaps in these days of tight timetables, that is about what it gets to.
See my students every day.
Yeah, that's right.
To see if they're still alive.
No, absolutely, absolutely. This is not undergraduate or graduate level research. These are 16 and 17-year-olds trying it out for the first time. They need a lot of help, a lot of support. We don't want them going off or just downloading something from coursework.com. We want them to actually enjoy the learning experience, but be supervised through it. So we have a kind of structured model for taking them through that. And I'm just jumping ahead. We structure the actual project they produce around these headings. So it is a reasonably conventional structure for an academic dissertation. But the advantage of having that structure is that not only do the students themselves learn a bit about how they would be expected to write if they do write a major thesis, university and beyond, but also it means you can break down this essentially rather large chunk of time into smaller sections. So you spend 4 or 5 weeks doing a literature review, 2 or 3 weeks maybe drafting an introduction, 5 or 6 weeks writing a discussion section, allow a few weeks at the end for review and editing and so on. And it doesn't, to be honest, it doesn't work necessarily with all students, but as a goal and aspiration, I think that's a much better way to proceed than simply saying, okay, you're doing a project, it's up to you how you manage your time, we'll give you 1 or 2 tutorials and hope it goes well. As I say, in my experience, that's really asking too much of students, even if they're PhD students, much less sixth formers. So I think I've probably said enough at the moment about kind of course models. We can talk a bit more about that if you have questions. I mean, there's various different ways that one could structure it. I prefer to spread it over both years in the sixth form if possible, partly because it's more fun, you get more time for discussion and argument, which is great fun, and partly as well because by the second year the students have a little bit more intellectual maturity, and so they're better able to tackle these quite challenging questions. The other element which we fed in to this sort of curriculum design, which I think has worked well, is the idea of teaching them about project areas. And again, this is the sort of thing you do in the seminar phase of the course at the start. Teach them about these project areas, partly again because these are good for developing their skills, partly because this is a way of saying, okay, these are the kind of areas you're likely to want to look at when you choose your research question. And that means that the choice of question, then the process of actually selecting the question is an informed process. I mean, you don't want students just plucking something out of thin air and saying, I'm going to spend the next 6 months working on this, because you need to be fairly confident that it's the sort of question which will actually work academically and intellectually. So these are the areas we came up with, and it's not a comprehensive list, and in fact we've effectively now been writing more material to supplement this. I mean, you'll notice, Bob will already have noticed, that the big missing area is environment. There's a new resource about to be published in the next 3 weeks actually, which actually has a substantial amount of material on environmental questions, because we learned very quickly that's something students are very engaged by and we should have had in as an area. So this is not a comprehensive list, but it's a way of just saying to students, these are the kind of issues that kind of overlap science, ethics and philosophy, where it would be useful for you to choose your question. I mean, they tend to go outside these limits anyway. I mean, I had a student in the first pilot year who wanted to do a project on Manhattan, the development of the nuclear bomb, Oppenheimer, all that sort of thing. And I said, well, that's a good question. Which subject area are you working under? And he said, quick as a flash, the beginning and ending of life. The other thing I found very quickly is if they can't find a subject area for you, there's something about artificial intelligence and will computers take over from humans in the next 30 years, they just put it under scientific revolutions anyway. So it's not there as a straitjacket, but it's a way of saying, you know, these are the kind of things to be looking at in your research. And when they've picked an area, we then really insist that they actually focus that down into a really concrete research proposal. And we insist that there's a clear question with a good rationale, where they've really thought carefully about the definition of the terms and the ethical and philosophical aspects and the underpinning science behind the question. And the choice of question is absolutely key with this approach. They've got to live with this for the next 6 or 8 months potentially. You can't allow them to go off down a route which will just dry up after 2 or 3 weeks, or even to pick something which could only be treated at university level, for example. So we spend a lot of time drafting these, negotiating and renegotiating them, trying to get the question fairly stable before they go too far. As I mentioned, we then have this process which gears into the writing of the different sections of the report as a fairly traditional academic nature.
Can I just ask quickly how you teach writing? Or are you going to
how we teach writing?
Like
the actual process of writing
the skills involved in the written phase?
No short answer to that. The long answer would be if you have a browse through our guidebook, because what we've done is we've put in, for example, in the first phase of the course, which is when you're developing the skills, we put in exercises where we put in exercises where there's some short writing responses needed, and then exercises where there's a little bit more writing, a longer piece. We give them structured pieces of particular argument analysis to write to. Then we might, for example, give them a mini project where they do a more substantial piece of writing before they actually get into the major project. And then once they're into the project, we've put into the resource lots of pro formas for planning the different sections, organising the material. So there's lots of stress on how the writing should be organised. The importance of defining key terms and where that should go. And then there's in the end, in the research methods section, we've also got guidance on what a good, well laid out piece of writing looks like, and how the different sections should integrate. Just little exercises where you all have gone off and done different projects, but you can pull them all together and say, let's have a look at these projects. Which ones do you think are well laid out on the page? Why do you think this one reads better than that? So there's quite a lot sort of coming through. Just, I mean, in a way, actually, teaching and writing is almost more than half of the skill here, because good quality writing is really what it's all about. So no short answer, but there's a longer answer in the book. I mentioned student presentation in there, as I said, for a couple of reasons. One, as a quality control check, and secondly, because of the intrinsic value of the course. And it's actually a very, very enjoyable part at the end of the course, having worked with them through this potentially quite gruelling year of research, to actually get them standing up and talking about their work. By this stage, most of them actually feel quite confident, and they've really gained an awful lot from the experience. And you get to hear things from the students which you didn't know yourself, which is just tremendous and very refreshing. And so it's a very nice and enjoyable way to end the course. It is still an assessed component, and we have some sort of processes that one has to go through to make sure the assessment is fair and reliable. You can have a look in the course spec if you want to follow all that through. But it's a very refreshing, enjoyable way to end the course. And something this course students don't themselves enjoy, having to make a presentation, but then having done it, it's tremendously valuable for them, and they know that's, for them, a hurdle which they've crossed. So that's a fairly comprehensive taster, I think, of the course. It's work which, as I said, has ramified into other subject areas, and what I've been involved in partly at rugby and partly in my work with Edexcel nationally is essentially now taking this approach and trying to generalise it to include other subject areas. I mentioned we've got some case study material on environmental ethics. We're also doing material on business ethics, various other approaches which would link more to the creative and practical forms of projects. So that's something I've been engaged in. And as well as resource development, there's a sort of programme of training and so on which is available if this is something which you think you or someone in your school wanted to take further. So we'll end this section with just a really nice quote from one of the pilot teachers interviewed as part of Ralph Levinson's research project. This I think really does say in a nutshell what the whole approach should be about, and it's just a very, very nicely put quote. I'm really enthusiastic about the course. I think it's probably the most enjoyable teaching I've ever done in my whole teaching career. I think it's because for once the students and I are actually exploring knowledge for the love of exploring knowledge, rather than trying to prove that Ohm's law is still Ohm's law. Okay, so that was one of our pilot teachers summarising the approach as it feels from the teacher's point of view. Okay, I'll pause at that point, and we've got half an hour for questions, discussion, and so on.
Yeah, well, thank you, John.
So to you. Yes, let's start.
Do you see any reason why this could not be broadened to include every sphere of learning?
Yeah, yes, perspectives on everything is what we technically call it. Absolutely. I mean, I think at the sort of fundamental level, I think it is, in a sense, a model for learning and thinking, as I said. So logically, it follows from that there's no reason why it couldn't then embrace really questions from any sphere. The thing, though, that the only pragmatic point that I would stress here is, students in arts or design and so on, they're already doing project work. So one key thing is that this extended project, as the name suggests, should be an extension. It should involve them doing something a little bit different. And one element, one way in which that can be achieved, of course, is by actually getting this cross-curricular thing in there. And as you see, it's intrinsic to the perspectives approach that it is cross-curricular. It embraces science, philosophy, ethics, and we construe science very broadly to include the social sciences as well as the natural sciences. So it's already quite broad. But I think getting the cross-curricular thing as a fairly important is really quite important, because otherwise students who do this can tend to just end up reproducing an economics essay or a piece of biology field work. So we would want them to do something a little bit different. But with that proviso, it ought to then work virtually anywhere, I think. Is that your...
Absolutely, but I think your point about encouraging a degree of exploring an area that they're not already studying formally seems to me absolutely essential, actually, if it's going to be genuine extension.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
that's right. I mean, you just don't want them to be just reproducing. I mean, partly, it raises issues of double assessment when you're marking. but also it's just a waste of their time, to be going over the same ground again, jumping through the same hoops.
I might just add from the university perspective, they still do need to know Ohm's law. I mean, that is serious, actually. We, in our university teaching, the whole of the second year of my teach is just techniques, how do you do things? And then you have fun in the third year.
Right.
Reading research papers. You really need to know these things. And I would just warn of making things too enjoyable in a way. There are facts and methods you need to know.
I mean, I think that's a very, very valid point. I mean, it's not in any way, I mean, this is an extended project. We're not suggesting at all this should take over from, their 3 or 4 A levels, whatever they would be doing, which is where they would be doing all of that as well. I think that's something.
Can I just take up that point? How do you stop this dominating their time? I mean, once they get locked onto something that's of interest, the danger is they're going to neglect Ohm's law.
Yes.
I can just see, if I take this back to my school, that question's going to be raised. How do you deal with that?
Well, the answer, I think, is, it actually, in practice, it tends to be the other way around, okay, in the sense that most of the students are extremely savvy nowadays, I'm sure you agree, about managing their time. They know what the requirements are for their university, they know, what they're going to be asked to get in terms of A-levels and so on. And at the moment, and this probably won't change, at the moment the extended project is unlikely to figure as part of what they're required to do, partly because of course it's not available in all schools at the moment. So it's more a question of differentiation, that this is something extra which would add value to their profile if they're applying. So with that in mind, it tends to be the other way around actually. It tends to be that they're very much enjoying doing all this discussion, debate, but then they're sometimes able students doing 4 or even more A-levels, they're thinking, gosh, I don't really have time to fit an extended project in as well. So actually, I don't think I've seen any situations where this has so taken over that their other work has suffered. There is, of course, as I said, the argument, and I think that this is an argument that will be proved once there's more research on the national cohort of students doing this. I think there is the argument that this does add something to their other subjects in terms of their ability to think independently and analyse and research. And this is partly one of the rationales for the introduction of the qualification. There's been a fairly repeated complaint from university admissions about students who just are expecting to be spoon-fed, expecting to, as it were, just be given pages and notes to learn for an exam when they get to university, because that's essentially how they've been taught at school. And so really that's one of the reasons why this approach has been looked on as offering something different, but it's designed to be complementary. It isn't designed to take over, it's designed to obfuscate. So I haven't seen any cases of students getting so excited by this other subjects go out the window. I think it is fair to say though that part of the rationale, part of the way that the QCA have been marketing this or advocating this be taken up in schools has been to say, look, if you've got students who are doing 3 A-levels and an AS already, then instead of doing another AS, as it were, for the sake of it, an extended project would be a very good choice then. So putting it in place, if you've got a timetable which gives you this flexibility, put it in place for the 4th or 5th AS level. And in my experience, again, that's very good advice, because what I find students can tend to do, very capable students still think that more qualifications equals more brownie points equals a better chance of getting into university, or a better chance of getting into their university of choice. And they then start making some really quite silly decisions about combinations of choices. So they'll do some English, Latin, history, and photography, just because they think they've got to have another qualification. So it's kind of targeting that issue really.
Yep, Sally, you've been making
if you're teaching research skills, then obviously you need some resources to research rather than just set them loose on the web. What do you suggest subscribing to? Do you subscribe to different sets of journals, Athens and that type of stuff, or?
Yeah. If your school has got the facilities, then something like Athens or JSTOR, if you know JSTOR, we use JSTOR and it's absolutely fantastic. It's not cheap, but if you look at it as a school-wide resource, then I think it's well worth the investment. And for something like this, it's absolutely perfect because it doesn't go right up to date, but then it's unlikely that that's going to be a limitation for most students. So I would certainly advocate something like that. I mean, if you take the question of resources, you can sort of take that at two levels. I mean, there's the resources that's needed for the first part of the course, and really, frankly, just buy the book is a good answer there, because we put in extracts from articles, documents, and so on. There's plenty there to get them started. When they actually then get into research themselves, access to a good academic archive would be great. One of the things I find students do, and this is something I encourage, is they're actually quite good at contacting academics themselves to actually say, okay, what shall I be reading on this question? Now, I noticed they can get a bit carried away with this, and I don't think Lord Winston will be best pleased with us, because I noticed that last year at least 3 of the students have decided to contact him. He had actually been gracious enough to reply to all of them. I have to warn now when I mention this at student conferences, don't all write to Lord Winston. But it's actually, I mean, most academics are quite pleased, I think, that someone in the school was interested enough to actually contact them. And that's something that works very well. Another very basic point is go to your library. I teach in an academically selective school, and the students do their work in the school library, which is fantastically resourced. And even though they're sitting there at their laptops or desktop terminals with the books all around them, I still have to say, don't forget the books. Okay, don't just go to the websites. Essentially, I would almost reward a student who's taken the initiative to sign on at their local library and find some resources there, just because it's showing some initiative.
Yes.
So this looks exciting. It provides a framework for the kind of things I've been wanting to try and do for a while. With that, I think we talked just a little about work demands and so on there. What kind of pupils choose to follow this course, and indeed what kind of teachers choose to teach it, or coerce it?
Well, with the question of what kind of pupils, everybody's initial assumption is it's just going to be your brightest and best. Okay, and that's not far from the truth, but it isn't quite the right answer. Obviously this does appeal to academically capable students who just relish the thought of doing some deeper research, and they need to be students with a certain amount of confidence in terms of writing and oral expression as well. But as a counter to that point, I've had extraordinarily capable students, students who've eaten their way through their examined qualifications, who haven't been able to do this. And the reason for that is because sometimes there are some very able students who have been so used to just soaking things up without having to go through the process of research and discovery and pushing at a question, finding you hit a block and then trying something a bit different. That whole process aspect hasn't been anything they've ever been required to do, and when they try it, they just find that it doesn't engage them. And so I think the best simple answer to the question of what kind of students does it work best with are the ones who are, as it were, intrinsically curious, intrinsically wanting to engage with these kind of questions. And they may be your academically brightest, but they may also be students who haven't been particularly switched on. I'm thinking now of a student from a few years ago who described this as the most enjoyable, he also used the phrase, the most enjoyable thing he'd done. And the reason was because he got a chance to choose a question which actually engaged his interest, and it did take him to a greater academic depth than his other subjects. So it's really about, are they the sort of student, do they have that kind of curiosity and a certain amount of stickability, really. They're not going to give up as soon as they're facing a challenge which they can't just get an immediate answer to. So that's really in terms of the type of students. Don't assume it's just for the brightest. That's not the case at all. In terms of the type of teachers, I suppose you've really got to actually be interested in these kind of questions. Although it's got science in the title, it's not a science qualification in the sense that it needs to be taught by a scientist. We use a cross-curricular teaching team, and I've had colleagues from languages, English, IT, geography involved. RE, obviously, if they've got interest and expertise in teaching ethical issues. So again, it's really teachers who enjoy this kind of interaction with the students, I guess, is the answer. The ones who can sit around the table and actually be part of the conversation rather than just standing at the front with the chalk and saying, here's the answer, shut up and learn it. Not that any of us teach that way, of course. Not unless it's just a week to the exam.
Yeah, it's very interesting to hear you talk. One anecdote I can just give from the university view looking back is that some of the students who flounder most at Oxford, at Cambridge anyway, are those who have come from highly structured selective schools like your own. They've always been told do this, 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 and you get the answer there. And they come and there's complete freedom here to do anything or nothing, and some of them do nothing, or some of them flounder.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the kids who have worked their way up through a comprehensive school as only one child per year goes to university or whatever, you know, they get here and they thrive often.
That's right.
So actually it may be a antidote to some of that problem, particularly for your type of school.
No, exactly. No, exactly. I mean, it is meant to complement what they're doing, not to replace it.
Yeah.
That's exactly where it comes. Yeah.
You've been waiting a long time for years.
This looks a little bit similar to in the International Baccalaureate program.
Yes.
There's a theory of knowledge, and there it's actually made a component. It's actually a failing component, if you like. You must do this course because it's considered so useful to help your thinking skills across all your subjects, and that students must do this, and they must do about 100 hours a year.
Yeah.
Do you think that in the future it would be strongly encouraged that all pupils do something very similar, so that they have that thinking skill built into the rest of their A-levels, so that all pupils, or once they finish and they go to university, they've actually got the same similar research, thinking skills background that will stand them in good stead, not just for university, but for other things?
Well, it's a good question. I think, I mean, it is actually, there's no, again, I'm afraid there's not a short and simple answer to this. It's a very interesting issue. This is actually not the Perspectives project itself, but the extended project will be compulsory for the students doing one of the new diplomas, which you may have heard of, which are sort of hybrid academic vocational qualification that the Department for Education has been developing for the last few years. Students doing the diplomas will have to do a project. So over the next few years as an examiner, I shall be seeing tens of thousands of these from A-level students, and also tens of thousands of these from students on diploma programs. And for them it will be compulsory. The question of whether it should be compulsory per se, I'm not myself fully persuaded about that. I mean, there is, I suppose, a slight difference here between the IB philosophy of education and the UK philosophy. I mean, with IB, in a sense, for example, we would all agree that curriculum breadth is a virtue. Okay, and then in the IB that becomes, as it were, compulsory. You have to do a broadly based curriculum at the age of 16. In the UK, we think, for whatever reasons, that by the time students are 16, 17, they ought to be allowed quite a high degree of choice, and they could therefore choose something that's broad or less broad. So I kind of think for those reasons, in terms of, if you like, our national philosophy of education, I couldn't see it being made compulsory. I think there's a very interesting move which has got some media. There was a piece in the TES 2 weeks ago in which an admissions officer from Bristol was calling for the extended project to become an entitlement for students. That is to say, they could all do it if they chose to, but it wouldn't be compulsory that everyone had to do it. I think that's a very good idea, and I suspect we will see that happen, which is one of the reasons I was saying this is a course which will grow very quickly. It's probable that within several years' time, most schools will have to offer this or something like it to their students.
Might be more useful than general studies.
Well, I have to be very careful. I mean, it's been filmed as well. The chair of our examiners is also chief examiner for general studies, or was for Perspectives. So I think the best way of saying it would be, again, this is trying to do something that's similar. But okay, we have the advantage that, in a sense, the assessment model that we're now allowed to work with, which frankly I was quite surprised 5 or 6 years ago when we started this, that the government would be happy to allow the equivalent of a half of an A-level to be done without an exam. That's a better assessment model, I think. Yeah, question.
Yes, we do these things at our school.
Oh, well done.
Really, it's really very good.
You were in Excel?
Yes, I think so, yeah. So it's very good. It doesn't diminish their other A-levels in any way at all. In fact, it improves their writing skills. So it's been fantastic. We've had, and you mentioned about your students writing to Lord Winston. We've had our students write to Richard Swinburne and things like this. It's been really good. And also it's been very good for their UCAS statements, because they can actually write on there, instead of saying, oh, I've got a part-time job in Sainsbury's, they can actually write about an area of research that they've done in depth. So it's been a success.
Great. Well, that's very good to know. I mean, the UCAS point, I haven't talked about that, but it is actually now, there's a line on the, as I'm sure you know, on the UCAS form. It's not quite long enough for the full research question yet. I need to have a conversation about that with UCAS at some point. But yes, I mean, I find both for the students writing their personal statements, but also for you writing a reference, it's an absolute gift, because you can write reams then about the fact they've done some real research and they've got a question. I've had, again, there's only anecdotal evidence at the moment. I'm sure there'll be more stories like this in the next few years. Students who've gone off to universities armed with their projects. I'm thinking now about a girl who applied, did a very nice project on the question of whether or not we should have opt-in or opt-out organ transplant system in the UK. She'd had very little success with her applications for medical school. She went off to one particular medical school where this kind of approach was in line with what they're doing, and that was the place that offered her. And she talked about a project, that was the place she got an offer from. So I think absolutely, I mean, there's a lot of
and just
potential.
to say that we did actually post-general studies of this.
Right, okay. Right.
Sorry, do they do it just over 1 year? Or?
They do it in 1 year actually. We've actually made it.
Oh, they do it in the upper six?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you do it over 2 years.
Yeah.
So you have much more of a build-up actually
That's right.
to it. So it's some ideas to take back actually.
I too taught at rugby, but back in the last century, and my colleagues were pretty fierce on a daily basis, even in the sixth form. I mean, it does strike me that this is quite an interesting tension in pupils' workloads, because on the one hand, they have people, by and large, wanting something done, if not tomorrow, this week. And that sort of pressure of keeping up with work on a daily basis. And alongside that, trying to maintain something which, even when you've structured it, has really much longer time scales. And I know that I have a whole set of things sitting in my study, books I had promised to read or things I was going to do, that I just never get to the top of the pile because tomorrow's task is more important. And I wonder how they cope with that.
Yeah, well, it's an excellent question. I mean, when I'm doing my extended projects training days, I start off with what now my colleagues on the examinations team have called it Taylor's left-hand rule. As I have a little sort of set of orthogonal digits, and which ones are they? There's a broadening skills component, widening skills, broadening perspectives, deepening understanding, and those are the sort of 3 dimensions of extension. So it's meant to capture this idea that extension means stretch in physics terms, but it can stretch in different ways. And we've talked plenty today about the cross-curricular dimension going across broadening subject areas. The deeper analysis, the depth of understanding comes through the philosophical component, but the single key element in terms of the skills, I think, is the skill of time management. I mean, it's an enormously challenging thing. I'm not sure I could manage a task. I mean, how will I manage if I was set a task and told, you've got 6 months to do this? How do you go about actually organising your time and then marrying it up against your other commitments? Very challenging thing to do. And I think the important thing with this approach is we do genuinely want students to advance in this area. We don't want to just be the person that stands over them all the time and says, right, by this day you need to have written this many words. I mean, there's a certain amount of that, to be honest, because that's the only way in which they do produce work. But nevertheless, within that, I would still expect them to have some significant choice over how that time has been used, and that's actually something we then try and assess. For example, one exercise we give them is there's a literature review planning document, and let's say I've set a kind of general time frame for the year, so that I know that they've got out of their, say, 16 or 17 weeks they've got to work on the project, about 6 weeks need to be spent, 5 or 6 weeks need to be spent actually researching on to find documentary sources. Okay, I kind of impose that structure and say, I want to see a literature review from you by such and such a date in December, but then they have to hopefully make some intelligent choices about things like, it would be better to sign on at the library in the first week rather than waiting till week 4 out of the 6th grade. So, it's not a huge amount of we're requiring from them, but we are actually requiring them to try and manage their time a little bit. But it's a very interesting area. It's an area where I think we'll see evolving practice over the next few years as this sort of embeds in the national curriculum and becomes more common. And hopefully, what I'm hoping is that more schools will do, as the lady next to you has indicated, actually get this properly timetabled so that you can actually then manage this alongside the students' other commitments. I mean, it's particularly difficult for the ones that really... I have some who are super keen and try and do it with no timetable teaching time at all, and that's very difficult, I mean, you can do it if they're very, very keen, but it's very, very difficult, because they're typically also doing 4 or 5 other A-levels. Yeah.
I have a daughter who did the AQA extended essay last year, when she chose an art topic, because she wants to study fine art, and wrote about Picasso's Guernica.
and she did it all in her own time. And it was a lot of time, but because she was so interested, she found that time. And it's been invaluable to her, as well as having them to get up and stand in front of governors and staff and pupils and so on and deliver a talk and be questioned. I think it's been incredibly valuable to have.
I was curious about the was it performance and artifacts as assessment. Have you got any examples? What the kind of thing that...
Well, the kind of thing, right, okay. So the performance would, well, the first thing to say with both those units is that although they're creative types of projects, creative outcomes, we still expect, as I mentioned, research and development of some thinking skills and so on. And so we'd expect a certain amount of writing to go with it as well. So a typical student doing a performance might put on a production, and often it will be a group production, obviously. And what we'd be looking for there is, well, I mean, there are 4 main assessment objectives: project management, research, development, and then evaluation. And the development would be talking about the process of putting on the production, what logistical issues they face, technical issues, key decisions they've taken in creative terms, how they've researched it, the influences behind it, and so on. Resources would be research, influences, sources, dramatic style, logistic issues about actually managing a production. Planning, we'd expect the key thing really with productions is suitability for the audience. Okay, I mean, the anecdote which because I'm not, you've probably guessed I'm not particularly the thespian type. We have the NXL qualification has 4 lead assessors, 4 lead moderators for the 4 different units, and my lead moderator for performance has a nice anecdote about a type of performance that probably wouldn't work very well, which is when 6th form girls put on a cabaret for the parents. And the key thing is to find a production which will be suitable in terms of length and style for your audience. So how well have they actually structured their work for that particular genre and that particular audience? And evaluation would come through and then doing a presentation and perhaps a discussion about it afterwards. So that's the kind of thing they do if they're doing performance. Quite similar if they were doing an arts-based project. There we would still expect some research and some written evidence, but probably it would take a different form, more of a sketchbook with portfolio, with design sheets and so on. So a sort of similar process, slightly different style of outcome. Is that the kind of thing yeah.
So perhaps a painting perhaps if it didn't, but the research behind it, what the meaning of the painting is,
that's right. Going back to my left-hand rule, it ought to do something more than they've done if they've just done an arts and design A level or BTEC in art and design. It ought to have this deeper, more reflective element and a cross-curricular way of doing it. It would be good as well.
Good. Yes.
To what extent do you give your younger students opportunities to discuss ethical issues? And I just wonder if starting this project has influenced how you teach the younger ones.
Yes, it has actually. Very concretely. We 2 years ago, Dennis isn't here today, so I'm going to use a verb he doesn't like. I perspectivised our citizenship course. In other words, we have to teach, all of us have to teach citizenship, but it's, let's just say, a teaching challenge to make learning about the structure of the European Court an engaging activity. So I thought that really a sort of proto-perspectives course with some ethics and some research, and some sort of it tends to be legal, ethical issues that tend to dominate, would be a great way of going. So we actually have a course, we call it Perspectives on Citizenship, and they do this in year 11, and they do a project. We don't make it compulsory. Well, we get them all to work on a project. We don't make it compulsory that they submit it. But there is actually, again, even less well known than the extended project, there are actually now projects at level 2 and level 1, so GCSE level projects, which you can enter for as a very good building block going into the project. And again, I found the ethical arena is a very fruitful one for working with students.